I think basically, at least in the West, the post-war period, starting with the 1950s, going all the way into the 1990s, was a period of intensive consumer capitalism. So ever more aspects of our relationship to the world and to each other and also to the self were mediated through market-oriented commodities. Identities were expressed through commodities, social relations were expressed through commodities, and there was spaces were commodified, cities were branded, and so on. So there was a more or less uninterrupted expanse of consumer capitalism, of consumer society, and with that of economic production, of commodity production, with all the environmental problems that we know. So the great acceleration in the 1950s is in a way exactly that, the extensifying of consumer capitalism. And what happened in 1996, if we want to take a particular date, but it's obviously never a date, but a period, is that a new space, a new social space emerged, the internet, that was not necessarily fully commodified, but where there was no, at least at that particular point in the mid-90s, no real commodity form that was native to that new space. So during that time, you could see there was an enormous breadth of experimentation of how to live in that space, what is possible in that space. Obviously, we had free software as one of those experiments. We had community networks as an experiment. We had all these forms of self-expression that didn't really have a commercial dimension, or at least a commercial intention by those who were doing these kind of self-expressions. When you think of early GeoCities, which obviously was a commercial platform, but the way people used it was not themselves viewing themselves as commercial actors producing commodities for the internet. And that was one part of that particular historical moment. And the other part of that particular historical moment was that the abilities to make and distribute copies at no or very low costs was allowing to think in terms of abundance, in terms of sharing, in terms of making available, rather than in terms of investment that then has to be recouped by controlling the circulation of copies. That, of course, also existed, but it also existed something else. And that, also together with free software and other projects, recreated quite surprisingly a notion of the commons, a notion that had existed in Europe for a very long time, but has been marginalized or made obsolete a long time ago. It's a notion that existed also in almost all other non-Western cultures in different forms, in different traditions, but that suddenly now reappeared or re-emerged or was re-articulated on the internet. And I think it was re-articulated at that particular instance precisely for these two reasons. It was made possible, physically possible, by the affordances, so to speak, of that infrastructure, but also by the need to find social forms that were adequate to that new space that had not yet been commodified at that particular juncture. The future in 1996 in relation to digital networks, the internet, I think, was dominated by relatively optimistic views about the possibility of participation, the possibility of free expression beyond the strictures of established media, circulation systems. There was at least from a Western European point of view, or perhaps from a European point of view, it's important to remember that the arrival of the internet beyond the very, very small technical communities kind of coincided with the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the doubling opening up of space. You had an opening up of space kind of on a European level, or even on a global level, kind of this post-Cold War set of ideas, and you had a new space opening up kind of on a global level with the internet, and that fostered a great enthusiasm, and we had all these ideas about democracy, participation, but also more generally what was then called the peace dividend. So we wouldn't need to waste all that money on the military as we had in the Cold War, but could now turn it towards something else. At the same time, 1992, there was the first Rio conference, so the limits to growth, this idea from the 1970s, was reappearing, but not yet at this kind of catastrophic scenario. It was more reappearing as something, eventually we should do something about it, but not now. Even though obviously the scientists were speaking differently, but that's kind of on a general kind of the mood of the time, at least as from my particular vantage point. So the near future thinking in the mid-90s definitely didn't prepare us to the present that we live now. I think we're in a quite interesting period. I think there's a widespread understanding that even though things continue as they have been for the last 20 years or so, they clearly cannot indefinitely continue like this. So there is a breaking point coming, and the question is, where will it break? How will it break? What happens in that breaking point? And there's on a lot of different levels, this breaking point is approaching. We're clearly overshooting planetary limits. I think it was just now that 1.5 degree global warming has been, reached. So that point of no return, we're blasting past it. But also more narrowly, if we think about the internet, kind of pretty much the other story of the last 25 years, this incredible consolidation of infrastructures, this incredible, the emergence of these global protocol-based monocultures of social networks. They also seem to have arrived at a juncture where they are still being used and they're still, powerful machines. But while early on they were used, with pleasure and with hope and with kind of a positive investment, they are now used even though they're hated. I think there's nobody in the world anymore who likes Facebook, who thinks Instagram is great, or would say that Twitter or X has improved for the better over the last couple of years. And there are reasons, and you can explain that kind of from a political economy point of view of how value is allocated in these. But it's also a moment of brittleness, where things can fall apart. And there's another level of something that we almost always have taken for granted that might fall apart. And while many of the other things that also might fall apart are hard to imagine falling apart in a positive way, if Facebook falls apart, if Twitter kind of implodes, this is actually a good moment. This is again a moment of trying to think from the ground up, to experiment. And for me, if we look in this particular moment, something like Ubu is kind of a proof that there are different ways of doing things, that these different ways of doing things are quite powerful, and I think most importantly that they have potentially a much longer lifespan than these hegemonic dominant infrastructures. I don't have the slightest idea. I mean, we're really, jumping off the map at the moment, kind of as, societies globally. So it's very hard to say. There are lots of kind of, dramatic worst-case scenarios. I don't necessarily think they will happen. I don't expect us to be enslaved by artificial intelligence. Maybe by artificial intelligence companies will be enslaved, but not by the technology itself. But I also think that if we also try to connect this in terms of planetary boundaries, we see two contradictory trends, or two approaches to that problem in terms of technology. One is, which I would say is the dominant one, is to say, fuck that, we don't care, we just burn everything we have, because we will eventually live on in some server farm in Mars. And then we have, many, many more consciousnesses, and we're all going to be happy there. And, this is just the price we pay to seed consciousness into the planetary system, right? We become an interplanetary species. It's this kind of thing, right? While I think it's this is stupid, and I don't think this will happen, it is a very powerful narrative not to worry about actual problems, right? In that view, all the things we talk about is kind of subsumed under existential risk. And existential risk means risk becomes then existential if it threatens the server farm. Right? Global warming is then a problem when it allows, or when it starts to impact negatively on the growth of compute. On the other hand, we also see a lot of attempts to, use the digital infrastructures in a different way, to think about how to reconstruct our relation with the material world, to understand that we don't need consciousness in machines, because we are living in a conscious world, that there are already many other consciousnesses here in animals and plants, in ecosystems and whatnot. And this technology allows us to develop a language for that at the scale of human agency, which is a planetary scale. And within that, I think something like an archive such as Ubu or any other of these archives can play a role in imagining a world beyond the commodity form. Right? This is kind of this old promise of the commons that I think has not been fully articulated and will be, I think, will have a renewed urgency, as we move into degrowth, whether we like it or not. And that's kind of one thing, that it is a tangible example of how to structure relationships that are not based on scarcity, they are not based on exclusion, they are not based on exclusivity, they are not based on any notion of ownership in this property relation sense, but are based on notions of affinity, of care, of temporary custodianship, with a sense of that at some point someone else will have to take over, and we have to build these bridges for other people to take over, because this is not something that we will, that we own and inherit and control in all eternity. That's kind of one thing that I think these things are really important. And the other thing is, on the level of technological infrastructure, that they allow, or these projects allow, to think, outside or against this notion of ever more intensive and resource intensive and computationally intensive infrastructures, and perma-computing is one of those terms that tries to think in other terms around that. And I think this is actually a really key issue, not just on an ecological level, that of course too, but for the last 30, 40 years or so, we had this notion that any process can be enhanced through the application of computational power. Either can be outright replaced or it can be enhanced. And I think that the task for the next 25 years is to look much more critically and say, in which areas do we perhaps have to decomputerify, if you can say that, right? So which processes are actually not enhanced by the application of or the addition of computational power, but are actually degraded in some way, and which processes are indeed enhanced, right? This is not an either or. I'm not advocating for going back to nature, because that doesn't work anymore. But I think we also, in terms of reasonable use of resources, we really have to think: is it worth putting in that area so many resources? Do I really need to have all of my photos automatically processed by an AI that uses so many so much energy, or is this perhaps not the right way to apply computing power? And which are really the things that we want? And one of the things that we want computing power is, I think, to help think beyond the commodity form, because it's still not clear what the commodity form in the digital would be. We tried blockchain, it clearly didn't work, and we can be grateful for that. So the imagination of beyond the property form in the digital is still quite a vast field.